many times in a case where someone gets taken down for what they're searching on the internet, what gets uncovered in their search history, or when law enforcement goes through their PC and finds all these files in their computer that possibly maybe shouldn't even be there, or maybe it's illegal to be there. Now, we know in this case, in Bryan Kohberger's, they went through his cell phone. We know that they plotted his potential driving route during the night of the murders, and then also they were able to get his Amazon purchase history, his click history, and then him possibly buying a black ski mask from Dick's Sporting Goods, this black ski mask that may match the description of what the witness saw during the night of the murders, where a suspect was potentially in their house. Now, we also find out that they investigated into Bryan Kohberger's personal PC, his Chrome history, the ATM withdrawals. Now, this isn't really anything special or anything, because if you were accused of a crime, you would be expected to have someone go through, all your electronics and stuff like that, the purchase that you're making, your financial transactions. But what we're finding out more is what the state experts may potentially say about Bryan Kohberger. Now, additionally, we are learning more about what the state's and the defense's theories are about the victims during the time of the murders. And then there's also a theory about how there could have been a potential cover-up at the crime scene, or not cover-up, cleanup at the crime scene. And man, it's crazy. We're getting closer and closer to the actual trial date. I know summer hasn't started yet, and this trial starts at the end of summer, but think about how time just flies by so quickly. It really does. But as the trial prep continues, and we see from these court proceedings that both sides are fighting about what evidence and what testimonies to be let in, we have a key ruling from the judge looking at what expert witnesses is going to be allowed to testify from the state side. I've chosen 7 of the critical witnesses to go over this so far to hopefully reveal more about this nebulous case. Hey guys, this is Corgi, a very sweaty Corgi. Thanks for joining us on this channel. I appreciate y'all being here. If you guys are new here, feel free to hit the subscribe button. That way you guys can know when I go live, and then y'all can stop by the live streams. We like to watch trials together, go over court documents and things like that. But other than that, thank you so much. I appreciate y'all being here. Enjoy the video. The defense has filed a motion in limine for vague and undisclosed testimony, I think. And essentially, the court has to decide what's fair game for the jury to hear when the trial happens. Now, a motion in limine is essentially a formal request to either exclude or limit evidence before it gets into trial. Kohberger's defense has asked the judge to exclude or restrict testimony from a long list of experts on the state's witness list, and arguing that some of the disclosures were vague, or that they were incomplete, or even speculative. Spoiler alert, the judge has allowed most of the experts to testify. It's funny because I don't know if the dog is barking because maybe I'm talking and he can hear me and that's what's triggering him to bark. I don't know, but hello, neighbor's dog. I don't know if you guys can hear him right now. But start off is FBI Special Agent Nicholas Balans. I don't know how to pronounce his last name. There's a double L in there. It could be Balance, but Balans sounds way more, I don't know, maybe it's fancier or something like that. But he's a member of the CAS team, and that's a cellular analyzing survey team, I think. Analysis survey team. I was close, though. Now, what's interesting about this special agent, I think his name popped up in the Lori Vallow hearing today because I think he's also an expert witness in her trial for the attempted murder on Brandon Boudreaux. Apparently, he wants to, he's willing to testify for Lori Vallow's case. However, because it's being live streamed, he wants to make it so his face is not shown and streamed across for everyone to see. Apparently, he might be involved in some undercover agent stuff, and basically this could possibly blow his cover. So the reason why I was really interested in hearing his testimony for the Lori Vallow trial is because there are potential issues with this case, specifically with Cy Ray, the defense's cell phone expert, essentially saying that, the defense, they are not working with everything that the state has, that the state's expert didn't include everything in their disclosures, didn't explain the full coverage maps, or explain why certain data points were not considered, and that because of this, there's the potentiality that there could be information or data that could be exculpatory to Bryan Kohberger. Now, Cy Ray did say that he was unable to fairly analyze Agent Balance's work. However, the judge did rule in favor of the state. They're not going to exclude Agent Balance's testimony. Instead, he did rule that Agent Balance had laid out enough methodology and data to support his opinions. Anything else could be fodder for a cross-examination for the defense. Let's read the judge's ruling. While his methodology might not be set forth with as much specificity as Mr. Ray, the defense expert, would like, Rule 16 does not require that detailed methodology be provided. It requires merely opinions, facts, and data for those opinions and the witness's qualifications. To the extent defendant believes Agent Bellens omitted important data or is relying on insufficient data for his opinions, this is fodder for cross-examination, not exclusion. So translation, the jury will be able to hear Agent Bellens' testimony about how cell phone data may place Bryan Kohberger in the hours leading up to the murders and then possibly afterwards. All right, so let's jump over to Kohberger's PC activity, his Chrome browsing history. Now, we have Heather and Jared Barnhart. They are, I don't know if they're like siblings or maybe they're family or maybe they're like husband and wife, but they're going to be working together as the digital forensic experts for the state. Now, they examine Kohberger's digital activity, his cell phone, and on his PC, and they identified what they called were gaps in behaviors that are abnormal during, before, and after the murders. They did say that these gaps could potentially be consistent with anti-forensic behavior or efforts to avoid leaving a digital trail. Now, they examined gaps found in Kohberger's PC, for example. They went through his event logs and system resource usage, monitoring from November 11 to November 16. Remember, the murders happened on the early morning of November 13. The Barnharts opined that it was quite abnormal given that school was still in session and that there was also gaps in Kohberger's PC Chrome history. However, there were still downloads that were occurring during this time, meaning someone could have been opening their browsers or their tabs in incognito mode, or they were clearing their browsing history. But however, if you were the defense, though, you could make a very clear and concise argument that, well, Bryan Kohberger being a male in his 20s, being a college student, is it really unusual for someone to be browsing in incognito mode or clearing your browser history? Now, if you think that most people that engage in criminal activities, that they should know better than to leave a digital trail to clear the browsing history or to browse in incognito mode, well, you'll be surprised. I mean, look at Brian Walsh, look at Corey Richins. I think that the state may argue that Bryan Kohberger was a meticulous, adroit criminology student who has the above normal knowledge of how to conceal a crime, which is why they're also trying to get that school paper that he wrote about processing a crime scene. And so the defense, they have pushed back. They are arguing that based on disclosures so far, it seems like these experts might be testifying about habit evidence. This is the only thing that I found so far in regards to habit evidence in Idaho. Idaho Rules of Evidence, Rule 406, Habit Routine Practice. Evidence of a person's habit or organization's routine practice may be admitted to prove that on a particular occasion, the person or organization acted in accordance with the habit or routine practice. The court may admit this evidence regardless of whether it's corroborated or whether there is an eyewitness. But the court did disagree with the defense's interpretation. And yes, I might be filming on a different day. Hello, guys. The court clarified that in the Barnhart's disclosure, they will not be discussing anything involving the word habit. In fact, they're just going to be focusing on the unusual gaps on Bryan Kohberger's cell phone and his PC during and before the homicides. Now, I don't understand how they would be able to flag something as unusual if you weren't really looking at someone's habit. This is where I would probably ask my chat if I was streaming live stream, like, what are your guys' interpretation of this? Because I don't have the experts. I don't have their, what's it called? The reports. We don't have access to it yet. I think it's probably sealed. The only indicator that is in this judge's order is that the Barnharts will say it is unusual because typically school is in session during this time. But I guess we'll have to wait for their testimony for them to expand more on their opinions and see if we will agree with them. In the trial, the defense can absolutely argue that, well, if we were to zoom out on Bryan Kohberger's activity, it's not unusual for Bryan Kohberger to be browsing in private mode or to be clearing his search history and showing there's downloads happening at the same time, because don't we all do it at some point? Haven't you done it before, jury? I'm sure there might be someone in the jury member that's done this before. This evidence alone may not be absolutely damning to Bryan Kohberger. However, the jury will have to consider the totality of all the evidence, and this could possibly be inculpatory evidence for Bryan Kohberger. They'll have to determine whether these gaps were intentional in trying to cover his tracks, or it could just be a mere coincidence. So our next witness is going to be Michael Douglas. And no, not Michael Douglas, the actor. This Michael Douglas has two S's in their name. He is an FBI agent who expertises who specializes in forensic accounting. Specifically, he's going to testify about Bryan Kohberger's card usage and his ATM withdrawals. He additionally will also be testifying about the financial transactions of the victims as well. To me, I think they're going to try to use Michael Douglas to try to flesh out a timeline of where the victims were before they were ultimately murdered. For example, we learned that the surviving roommates, were hanging out with Kaylee and Madison that night. And at some point, they all came back home. But I think Kaylee and Madison ended up going out to a food truck to go eat because that's what college students do. You know, you go out after a long night of drinking and then you decide to get food and then sleep off all the alcohol. Xana and Ethan eventually came home, and I believe Xana was the one who ordered DoorDash around 4 a.m. Now, unlike the other experts that we were talking about earlier, this expert will be focusing on Bryan Kohberger's spending habits. However, he is only going to be focusing on the facts only and not on speculation, and I'll explain a little bit. Going back to the court document, moreover, although the supplemental disclosure appears to indicate that he will offer an opinion as to the defendant's spending habits, his testimony will be limited to factual changes in how the defendant spent money. For example, the disclosure notes defendant only conducted ATM withdrawals on and after the date of the homicide and ceased using his debit card, after November 10, 2022. Now remember, the murders happened in the early morning of November 13. Whereas prior to November 10, he had regularly used his debit card. There is no indication he will attempt to opine about the reasons for the spending changes, just that they occurred. So he's not going to be speculating. He's not going to be saying like, oh, the reason why Bryan Kohberger may have decided to, change his spending habits because of this, because of that. That's probably for the detectives or the lead investigators going to be testifying on the stand. This guy is just a fact witness who's just going to be basically going over what he observed and then relaying that over to the jury. The detectives, when they are testifying, they could potentially use this to suggest maybe a consciousness of guilt, that maybe Bryan Kohberger had changed his behavior after the crime to either maybe avoid detection or to conceal his movements possibly. I don't know. Can you guys explain to me how that would work? Because the ATM card, I'm assuming, is under Bryan Kohberger's name. So unless it was like, for example, if it was a burner phone, right? You're using the burner phone during the time of the murders, and then when the murder is done, you throw the burner phone out and you stop using it. Like, for example, if you were someone who committed a crime, you were using your personal debit card normally, and then after you committed the crime, you stopped using it. Why would you stop using it? How would that help or benefit you? I don't know. I'm just curious about this. Maybe it's not important to them, but I'm just curious because I'm sure they'll just present the facts and then maybe it'll trigger to the jury's mind like, oh yeah, that is weird. But if you were the accused person, why would you engage in that kind of behavior? Maybe there's no explanation for it. Can you guys tell me? It's probably something super basic that I'm missing out here. And y'all can just yell it at me in the chat. Or not in the chat, in the comments. The only thing I can think of is if Bryan Kohberger opened this bank account and had this checking card and was not expected for him to have this card traced back to him somehow. Or, like if he committed the crimes, he was hoping that law enforcement would never unearth this other checking account that he had. I don't know. Okay, let's hop on to the next witness. We got Shane Cox, who is a litigation and regulatory manager at Amazon. He's expected to testify about Bryan Kohberger's Amazon account activity, like the click history, the purchase history, what Bryan Kohberger was potentially searching for. Now, remember, apparently this was on a maybe family computer, so I can see that a defense going to argue that, well, how do we know it's Bryan Kohberger? How do we know it's not the family members? We do know that Bryan Kohberger's family members are planning to testify. And so I'm sure the state will be able to list out a testimony on whether or not they were the ones. Like, hey, were you the ones that were purchasing the K-bar knife? Were you looking for a knife? Were you looking for a knife sheath and things like that? Or even maybe the Dick's Sporting Goods, because I don't know if that was shipped to Bryan Kohberger when he was at his Washington apartment or when he was still living in Pennsylvania with his parents. Now, they're going to look through his order history from January 5th, 2022, all the way to December 13, 2022. They're going to look at his click history and the sign-in history as well. Now, I do wonder if this family computer was, because back then when we had a family computer, it was just like one login and everyone shared the profile. However, nowadays, you can create separate profiles for each person. That way, your stuff is not all commingled with your family members, or your family members can't really see what you're doing or what you're downloading or maybe your search stuff. So think of this testimony as a way to fill the, digital timeline of what Kohberger was possibly doing online and when. We also learned from other court documents that Bryan Kohberger may have potentially purchased a K-bar knife and a sheath based on the Amazon purchase. That is the state's theory. And after the murders, the state believes that Bryan Kohberger also continued searching for the K-bar knife. And that would probably explain, if you have a murder weapon that needed to be discarded, well, maybe you need a replacement. So we'll have to wait for the trial to see if this really plays out to how we see in the court documents so far. Because, sometimes when we give too much high hopes for the state, sometimes the state might disappoint. Or there might be a misrepresentation of facts or an exaggeration of a certain evidence. So we're going to jump on this other expert where we learn that the defense believes there was a possible cleanup at the crime scene. Now, Detective Darren Gilbertson, that's going to be a mouthful for me. Darren Gilbertson, I can say this. Detective Darren Gilbertson. His testimony is going to spark a huge debate between the defense and the state because Gilbertson apparently did a time simulation of how long it would take to possibly commit these murders. Based on his walkthrough, he found that the murders could have been committed within 2 to 4 minutes, which fits into this very tight timeline of how long the suspect could have potentially been in the house, which was, I think, 12 to 13 minutes. The state looked at the suspect vehicle based on surveillance footage in the nearby area that it arrived at a certain time, and then after 12, 13 minutes, I think, it bolted out like Speed Racer. The defense did object to this, saying that this run was not scientific, that it was conducted in a vacant home, and that it could have potentially prejudiced the jury. The defense's own expert, Brent Turvey, he's the one who's going to opine about, well, there could have been multiple assailants that did this, and then additionally, there was direct and indirect evidence that there was a cleanup at the crime scene. Now, I haven't found any documents that talks about why they believe there could have been a cleanup. Now, if there was a cleanup, that would lead people to believe that, okay, if they attempted to clean up the crime scene, then obviously it's going to take a lot longer for the suspect or suspects to be inside the house, not within the tight timeline that the state is alleging. We already know that the defense is claiming that this is a multi-assailant job. They are claiming that Bryan Kohberger lacks the poise, the coordination in order to move, stealthily throughout the house, murdering 4 people due to his diagnosis of developmental coordination disorder. I'm laughing because that one always gets me. I always forget. I got my notes right here, thank goodness. Now, this is what the defense team says. However, the judge did point out that, well, just because you're claiming this doesn't mean it's true because even your own expert hasn't linked the developmental coordination disorder to Bryan Kohberger not being able to commit this crime. Now, there's also another interesting thing, and this kind of makes sense now based on some of the news coverage because they believe that the defense believes that multiple weapons were used against Kaylee Gonzalez. This is something that I've never heard before, but now I remember it's starting to make sense. Steve Gonzalez, if I remember correctly, has done interviews where he believes that Kaylee was targeted. And I remember hearing this as well in some other comments somewhere, or maybe some news coverage that they believe Kaylee was targeted. And so maybe I missed this detail, but I didn't know there was a theory that multiple weapons were possibly used on her. Now, the defense also believes that Xana and Ethan were attacked at the same time. So maybe Kaylee was targeted because maybe her murder was more brutal compared to the others. And maybe the theory is that the rest of the roommates that were murdered were just basically collateral damage. Now, is the judge going to exclude this detective's theory about his time run? No, the judge did say that based on the detective's qualifications, his experience, it would qualify him to offer expert opinion about how long they think the suspect could have possibly moved throughout the crime scene. And that it was also a basic time and motion exercise done at like a slower speed and done at like a faster speed. Now, the defense, they're going to argue this, of course. They're going to say that, well, Detective Gilbertson being the lead detective, of course, he would know the layout of the house and how to navigate more easier than a suspect who may potentially have never been there before. Also, when he did these time runs, it was when the house was vacant. So no furniture, no rugs, no, random things that could be in the way of a suspect that could potentially cause someone to slow down as they're navigating in a dark home. Additionally, the defense argued that, well, the house is now torn down. We can't do our own time run. But you guys got to remember that both sides agreed to have the house to be demoed. I don't know why. I feel you should just have it up just in case, but it's something that's already been done, so the defense can't do their own time run. So the judge did say that Gilbertson can testify about this and defense can cross-examine to poke holes about the time run and maybe, say that you were familiar with the layout or there was no furniture in the house when you did this. Could your time run have been affected immensely because of this? Gary Dawson is going to testify about Madison Mogen's blood alcohol content during the time of her death. He's going to opine and say that during the time that she was suddenly attacked, she would have been so drunk that she would have been unable to physically resist her attacker. Again, this is going to be the state's rebuttal against whether or not there were multiple assailants and whether or not it's possible that multiple weapons could have been used on Kaylee Goncalves. So the defense did object, saying that, well, this is, rebuttal theory that hasn't really been raised yet. But, the judge did rule saying that this is all fair game, that this could be preemptive, rebuttal evidence against the defense's claim that there were multiple assailants. Judge Hippler said that, well, if Madison Mogen was unable to defend herself, it's possible for this one suspect to incapacitate her and then use multiple weapons against Kaylee Goncalves. Oh my God, that sounds so sad. Dawson's testimony can help the state in rebuttal to support that there was a one perpetrator theory. However, it's going to depend on the defense's expert, Brent Turvey, whether or not he's going to put out this multi-assailant theory and that there were multiple weapons used on one of the victims. But based on this, I don't know, I think maybe even the state agrees that multiple weapons could have been used on Kaylee Goncalves. So, man, we're starting to get some details that I have not heard from before. And, I wonder if some of these news outlets, maybe they have like inside source or something like that. Now, lastly, we have Rob Hill, who's going to be testifying about the surveillance and the front license plate, because there is debate on whether or not you can clearly see in the surveillance footage that this white suspect vehicle was missing a front license plate, which I believe is similar to Bryan Kohberger. It's going to be, experts battling it out. The defense expert is going to say, well, based on the surveillance footage, you can't really tell if the plate was visible or not. However, the state's expert said that based on his experience, his knowledge, and viewing certain clips, you can clearly see that there is no front license plate on this white suspect vehicle. So let me see. The defense wants to argue that, he can only testify about the clips that he cited, not the whole video. However, the judge disagreed. The judge said that Hill can testify about everything that he reviewed and his rebuttal will be allowed. It will go directly to the credibility of the defense's own expert witness. As this case is moving towards trial and we're getting there real soon, I know it's only 5 months out, but or is it 5 months out? Maybe it's 4 months out. 4 months out, September. Yeah, September, right? It's becoming clear. Or is it August? Jesus, let me check my dates. Oh, yes, August and November trial. Woohoo. Okay, guys. I mean, that's like less than 3 months. We're almost there. We're starting to get more of a clearer picture of what the state and the defense is going to plan to argue at trial. Now, the defense's theory, we are starting to learn that they might put out a multiple assailants theory, that there are possible multiple weapons that were used, and that the sequence of events are not as simple as what we initially thought, that it's actually a lot more complex than what we believed. For example, Kaylee, Goncalves, the theory of her being attacked with multiple weapons. Is that a multi-assailant job, or is it one person in a frenzied act of violence? Then jumping back to Madison Mogen's toxicology report, the state is going to say that she was so drunk at the time that she was unable to physically defend herself. Now, that leads to a very chilling reality. Was the killer or killers, were they planning on that? Was that something that they were relying on? College students going out on a weekend and being really drunk to the point where it might give someone courage to attack not just one student, but 4. And then looking at Bryan Kohberger's spending habits, is it going to be something that is nefarious or just something that is harmless? And then there's the digital trail, or I guess the lack of, in the PC usage, in the Chrome history. The Cellbrite expert said that Kohberger had these unusual gaps in his activity. I mean, is it just accidental, or could it just be coincidental? But perhaps the most confusing and intriguing one to me is the defense's theory that there could have been a possible cleanup at the crime scene. I mean, who tried to clean it up and when? And what are the indicators for that? I'm so curious about that. I mean, I'm going to be honest with you guys. It looks really bad for Bryan Kohberger. We're seeing a lot of really salacious headlines, but we got to be prudent. We got to wait for the trial to happen. Yes, it looks so bad for Bryan Kohberger so far, but I'm very curious about some of these defenses theory. Aren't you?